The coffee cup slipped from her trembling hands. A strange, bitter taste coated her tongue as her vision blurred. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed against the kitchen counter. The man she had given up everything for, selling her home, draining her savings, watching him walk again after surgery, stood just a few feet away, holding the empty glass bottle. "Why?" she whispered, her voice rasping like dry leaves in the wind. His eyes were cold. "You should have stayed out of my life after you paid." Her stomach twisted, the pain shooting like knives through her chest. She reached for the phone, but her body would not obey. He stepped closer, his shadow covering her like a dark cloud. Her breathing slowed. Her world dimmed. The last thing she saw before her eyes shut was his faint smile. Amara Joseph was the kind of woman who believed in helping people, sometimes too much. She was 54, a retired schoolteacher, and well known in her neighborhood for her open door and warm heart. If a neighbor's child couldn't afford lunch, Amara would quietly slide an envelope under their door. If an old friend needed a place to stay, she would make up the guest room. Her house, a modest but cozy 2-bedroom bungalow, was her sanctuary. It had taken her 30 years of teaching to pay it off. She'd planted lemon trees in the backyard and kept a small garden of bright hibiscus flowers by the porch. Every corner of that home carried memories. Birthdays with her late husband, late-night talks with her sister, quiet afternoons marking exam papers while rain tapped at the windows. But life had grown lonely since her husband, Michael, passed away 5 years ago. Amara filled her days with reading, gardening, and visiting the local church. It was at that church she met Richard. Richard Nwosu was younger than her, 41 tall, with an easy smile that made people instantly like him. He'd joined the church choir, and although he wasn't the best singer, he had a charm that drew people in. They became friends first. Richard was a widower, or so he said, and had no family nearby. Amara enjoyed his company. He'd visit her after Sunday service, sometimes helping her carry heavy bags from the market. He told her stories about his late wife, his difficult life, and his dream of starting over. Then one evening, while they sat on her porch sipping tea, Richard told her something that would change everything. He said he'd been diagnosed with a rare spinal condition. His back pain had worsened, and without urgent surgery, he risked being permanently disabled. The surgery, he explained, would cost over 12 million naira, money he didn't have. "I've tried everything," Richard said, his voice cracking. "I even thought of selling my car, but it's not worth much. Amara, I don't know how much longer I can walk." Her heart twisted. She thought of her late husband, who had suffered in silence before his death. She couldn't bear to see someone else she cared for go through that. At first, she offered to help him raise the money. They went to charity groups, appealed to the church, but raised only a fraction of the amount. Weeks passed, and Richard's condition seemed to worsen. One night, she found him doubled over in pain, sweat dripping from his face, barely able to stand. That night, Amara made a decision that would cost her everything. She contacted a realtor the next morning and put her house on the market. It sold in less than 2 weeks. The money from the sale, along with her life savings, was enough to cover Richard's surgery. When she told him, Richard broke down, holding her tightly. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You've saved my life." The surgery was scheduled in Lagos. Amara stayed in a cheap guest house nearby, while Richard was admitted. She visited daily, bringing him homemade meals, sitting by his bed and reading to him. After the operation, he recovered quickly. Within days, he was walking again. Everyone in the ward praised Amara's kindness. She felt proud, happy even, but when they returned to town, things began to change. Richard stopped visiting as often. When she called, he sometimes didn't pick up. Weeks earlier, he had been desperate for her company. Now he seemed distracted, even distant. One Friday afternoon, he showed up at her rented apartment unannounced, holding a small basket of fruit. "I just wanted to check on you," he said, smiling. "You've done so much for me. Let me make you some tea." They sat together, sipping. The tea tasted slightly different, but Amara didn't think much of it. That night, she woke up with severe stomach pain. She assumed it was food poisoning and tried to sleep it off. 2 days later, Richard came again, with more tea. This time, she didn't finish it, but within an hour, the cramps returned worse than before. Her neighbor found her slumped on the kitchen floor the next morning and called an ambulance. In the emergency room, doctors ran tests and found something alarming in her blood: poison. And Richard was nowhere to be found. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and sharp fear. Amara lay on the bed, her skin pale, her lips cracked, and 4 lines dripped clear fluid into her arm. She was weak, barely able to turn her head when the doctor entered. "Mrs. Joseph," he said gently, "the tests show high levels of organophosphates in your blood. That's a type of pesticide. Do you remember eating or drinking anything unusual?" Her mind swirled. The tea, the strange taste. Richard's smile. Her voice was hoarse. It was him. The doctor exchanged a look with the nurse. "Do you mean someone poisoned you?" Amara nodded weakly, tears stinging her eyes. That was when the police were called. Detective Folake Durogi was the first to arrive. She was in her mid-40s, short but sharp-eyed, with the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen far too much ugliness in the world. She walked into Amara's hospital room, notebook in hand. "Mrs. Joseph, I'm here to get your statement," Folake said. "Can you tell me exactly what happened before you fell ill?" Amara took a slow breath and told her everything: how she'd met Richard, the surgery, the tea, and the sudden sickness. Folake's pen moved quickly across the page, her face unreadable. "Where is Richard now?" the detective asked. I don't know," Amara said. "After the second time I got sick, I didn't see him again." "Do you have his address?" "Yes. I've been to his house before." "Folake, close her notebook. We'll find him." By the time they got to Richard's apartment later that day, the place was nearly empty. The furniture was gone, cupboards bare. It looked as though he'd left in a hurry. One of the neighbors, a young man with bleached hair, peered out from his doorway. "He left 2 days ago," the neighbor said. "Had some men load a truck with his things. I asked where he was going. He said, somewhere better." Folake scanned the room again, looking for anything he might have left behind. She found a crumpled paper in the corner, a receipt from a bus company, dated the day after Amara was hospitalized. Destination: Port Harcourt. Back at the hospital, Amara was moved to a high-dependency ward for closer monitoring. The poison had damaged her liver, and she was in constant pain. But she refused to rest completely. She wanted to know everything the police were doing. Folate came by the next morning. "We put out an alert at all bus stations and airports," she said. "But I need you to prepare yourself. People who do this don't always stop after one attempt." Amara's chest tightened. "You mean he might try again?" Folake's eyes were steady. "If his reason for poisoning you was to finish you, then yes. And until we catch him, you're not safe." 2 days later, Folake got a call from her partner, Detective Idris. They had located Richard. At least, his name appeared on a guest list at a small lodge near Port Harcourt. But when officers arrived, the room was already abandoned. On the bed was a half-drunk bottle of soft drink. Lab tests would later confirm it had traces of the same pesticide found in Amara's blood. The pattern was clear. He was moving from place to place, leaving poison items behind like breadcrumbs. And then Folake got a troubling message from an informant in Port Harcourt. Richard wasn't alone. He was with a woman, and she looked just as unsuspecting as Amara had been. That night, Folake called Amara. "We found him," she said. "But there's more. He's got someone new. And if our guess is right, she's in danger too." Amara's heart pounded. "Detective, you have to stop him before it's too late." Folake paused, her voice low and urgent. "That's what I'm afraid of, Mrs. Joseph. I think he's already making his move." Port Harcourt's humid air clung to Detective Folake's skin as she and Idris stepped out of the police van. The lodge stood at the end of a narrow street, half hidden behind palm trees. Paint peeled from the walls, and a rusty sign swung in the evening breeze. Inside, the front desk clerk looked up with tired eyes. Folake flashed her badge. "We're looking for this man," she said, sliding over a photograph of Richard. "He was here 2 nights ago." "Where did he go?" The clerk hesitated. I don't want trouble. You'll have more than trouble if another woman dies because you stayed quiet, Folek said sharply. The man swallowed hard. He left with a lady yesterday. Said they were going to a place called Creekview Apartments. That's all I know. Creekview Apartments was a newer building on the other side of town, painted white with metal gates and a guard who barely glanced up from his phone as they approached. Folek didn't want to alert Richard too soon. Instead of storming the place, she and Idris set up surveillance from a small shop across the road. Hours passed. The street dimmed into night. Just as Folek was about to send Idris for food, a familiar figure stepped out from the building. Richard. He was dressed casually, carrying a small plastic bag. Beside him was a woman, young, maybe late 20s, wearing a bright yellow dress and laughing at something he said. Folek's stomach tightened. She could almost see Amara in that woman's place. Let's tail them, she whispered. They followed the pair to a roadside eatery. Richard and the woman sat at a corner table. From their position outside, Folek saw him open a plastic bag and pull out 2 bottles of malt drink. He twisted one open and pushed it toward her. Folek's fingers clenched around her phone. Idris, look at that. He's doing it again. Idris nodded grimly. Do we move now? Not yet. I need to see if he drinks from it too. They watched. Richard took a sip from his own bottle, then urged the woman to drink hers. She hesitated, laughing nervously, then lifted it to her lips. Folek's decision was instant. Go. The moment they entered, Richard froze, his eyes darting between them. Folek strode up to the table. Police, she said, pulling the bottle from the woman's hands. Don't drink that. The young woman looked confused, her face paling as Idris showed his badge. Richard tried to stand, but Idris blocked him. Folek set the bottle on the table and spoke in a low, controlled voice. We'll have this tested. If it matches what was in Amara Joseph's blood, you're done. The woman's chair scraped back. Amara who? What's going on? Folek glanced at her. Miss, you need to come with us. This man is under investigation for attempted murder. Richard's jaw tightened. You can't prove anything, he said softly. Folek leaned closer, her eyes cold. Oh, we will. Back at the station, the woman, whose name was Chica, gave a trembling statement. She'd met Richard just 3 weeks ago. He told her he was a businessman recovering from surgery, alone in the city. He'd been sweet, generous, and just that morning, he'd offered to help her relax with a drink. The malt bottle was sent to the lab immediately. Folek didn't sleep that night. She kept thinking of Amara lying pale in the hospital, and of how close Chica had come to the same fate. 2 days later, the results came in. The malt bottle tested positive for the same organophosphate poison found in Amara's blood. It was enough to arrest him formally. But just when Folek thought the case was about to close, Idris walked into her office with a thin file in his hands. You're not going to believe this, he said. Inside the file were reports from 2 other states. 2 women, both dead, both with traces of the same poison in their system. And in both cases, the last person seen with them was Richard. The file on Folek's desk felt heavier than it looked. She opened the first report, a case from Enugu, dated a year ago. The victim, a 48-year-old widow named Blessing, had died suddenly after dinner with a new male friend. The autopsy listed possible food poisoning, but no toxicology test had been done at the time. The second file was worse. It was from a Badan 8 months ago. A 35-year-old seamstress, Funk, collapsed during a church program. Witnesses saw her sipping from a bottle of fruit juice given to her by a man they only knew as Richie. In both cases, there were no arrests. No one had connected the dots. Until now, Folek felt a chill. This wasn't just a man trying to harm Amara. This was a pattern. A predator moving from state to state, leaving no trace but dead women and whispers. That afternoon, she went to the hospital to see Amara. The older woman was propped up in bed, her skin still pale, but her eyes sharper. Did you find him? Amara asked immediately. Yes, Folek said, pulling a chair closer. We caught him before he could hurt someone else. But Amara, I need you to be prepared. There's a chance he's done this before. To other women. Amara's mouth fell open. Other? How many? We're still finding out. But you're not his first. For the first time, Amara's grief was mixed with something else. Anger. Then you must stop him for good. Don't let him do this to another woman. Back at the station, Folake and Idris started digging deeper into Richard's past. His real name, they discovered, was Richard Ogendyke. He'd been arrested once in 2012 for fraud, but released due to lack of evidence. Since then, he'd moved constantly. Port Harcourt, Enugu, Ibadan, back to Lagos, never staying in one place longer than 6 months. Folake requested financial records and found something interesting. After each suspected poisoning, Richard's bank account received a... Idris frowned at the numbers. Looks like he's not just killing for spite. He's doing it for money. Folake nodded. A romance predator. Gains their trust, drains them dry, then poisons them so they can't fight back. 2 days later, they got their first false lead. A tip came in from a bus station attendant in Warri, claiming he'd seen Richard boarding a bus weeks before. Folake and Idris drove there in the rain, only to discover it was a different man entirely. Back in Lagos, they tried to track Richard's last known contacts. One number led to a prepaid SIM with no registration. Another to a man who claimed Richard owed him money for business deals and had vanished without paying. The investigation was stalling, and Folake knew time wasn't on their side. Richard was in custody for the malt poisoning, but the older cases had no physical evidence tying him directly. If they couldn't link them, he might walk free on the current charge. One night, Folake was still at her desk when Idris entered with a small envelope. This came from the lab, he said, handing it over. It's about the plastic bag from Creekview Apartments. Folake opened it and pulled out a photograph, a close-up of the bag's inside seam. There was residue, the same pesticide. It was their link. But before she could celebrate, the phone on her desk rang. It was the holding cell sergeant. "Ma, we have a problem," he said, his voice tense. "Richard, he's gone." Rain hammered the station roof as Detective Folake gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean he's gone?" she demanded. The sergeant on the line stammered. We were moving the suspects to the transport van for a court appearance. The power cut out, total blackout. When the lights came back, his cell door was open. We think someone helped him." Folake slammed the phone down and grabbed her jacket. Idris was already by the door, his jaw tight. "This was planned," he said as they hurried to the holding area. "No one just slips out of police custody in 2 minutes unless they know exactly what they're doing." The rain-slicked streets outside the station shimmered under flickering street lamps. Folake scanned the shadows, but there was no sign of Richard. The first thing they did was check the CCTV footage. Half of it was useless, grainy static during the blackout. But one camera, backed up to a separate power source, showed a man in a dark raincoat lingering near the station's side entrance minutes before the outage. His face was hidden, but the way he moved, quick, purposeful, suggested training. Whoever helped Richard wasn't just a friend. They were skilled. The next 24 hours were chaos. A citywide alert went out, and checkpoints sprang up on major roads. Folake worked the phones, calling every contact she had in Port Harcourt, Enugu, Ibadan. She was looking for any hint of Richard's next move. Then, a break came from an unlikely source, a call from Chica, the young woman they'd rescued at the eatery. "He called me," she whispered over the line. "Richard, he said he wants to meet to explain everything." Folake's heart pounded. "Where?" "A small guest house in Ikorodu. He said to come alone. He doesn't know I've spoken to you." Folake signaled to Idris. They would set up a sting. That night, they positioned plainclothes officers around the guest house. Chica went inside with concealed wire, her voice trembling as she greeted Richard. "I didn't think you'd call," she said. "I had to," Richard replied. "The police are framing me. That woman, Amara, she's lying. I never poisoned her." Folake listened from the van, jaw clenched. Then Richard said something that made her sit up straight. "Amara isn't the first to betray me. I've dealt with women like her before, and I'll deal with her for good when this blows over." There it was, a near confession, Before they could move in, Richard's tone shifted. "You didn't tell anyone about this, right?" he asked Chica. "No," she lied smoothly. But something in her voice must have tipped him off. There was a scraping sound, chairs moving, then Richard's voice, low and sharp. "You're lying." The officer stormed the room, but Richard was already out the window, vanishing into the night rain. 2 hours later, Folek sat in the van, soaked and exhausted. Idris reviewed the wire recording. "It's not a full confession," he said, "but it's enough to show intent. Combine it with the lab results, and we might be able to hold him if we get him again." Folek nodded slowly. "We'll get him, but we need something stronger, something that ties him to every single victim." And then it hit her. The older case files mentioned a specific brand of bottled drink in 3 different incidents. If they could trace the purchase history, they might find a trail. The next morning, Folek called the bottling company. After some resistance, a manager finally provided purchase records for bulk orders made in Richard's name over the past 2 years. And there it was, 3 separate orders, all shipped to addresses linked to his past victims. But there was one more order placed just last week. The delivery address was a small town outside Abeokuta. Folek looked at Idris. He's already planning his next one. The sun was just rising when Folek and Idris hit the road toward Abeokuta. The highway was damp from the night rain, mist curling low over the asphalt. The urgency in the car was thick. You could almost hear it in the way Folek's fingers tapped the dashboard. Richard wasn't just running anymore. He was hunting. The delivery address from the bottling company led them to a quiet rural community, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business. Chickens pecked in the dust along the roadside, and old women in headscarves sold yams from woven baskets. At the small kiosk listed on the order form, a woman in her 60s greeted them warily. "Yes, I signed the package," she said. A man delivered it himself. "Said it was a gift from my niece. She runs a sewing shop in the next street." Folek's gut tightened. "Where's your niece now?" "At her shop. But the man said he would come by later today to check the fit of a shirt she was sewing for him." It was him. The sewing shop was a small, sunlit space, its front wall open to the street. Inside, a young woman in a blue wrapper worked a machine, humming to herself. Beside her was a table with 2 bottles of malt drink, the same brand from every case. Folek approached quietly. "Miss, listen carefully. Don't drink from those bottles. And if a man named Richard comes, you need to leave immediately." The woman's eyes widened. "Is he dangerous?" "Yes," Folek said, her voice firm. "Very." They moved her to a safe location while plainclothes officers took up positions around the shop. Hours passed. The heat of the day pressed in, making the air heavy. Then, just after noon, a figure appeared at the far end of the street, tall, wearing a cap low over his face. Richard. He walked casually toward the shop, hands in his pockets, glancing around as if checking for familiar faces. Folek felt her pulse quicken. Richard stepped inside and paused. His eyes flicking the table where the bottle "Still Saturday, where's the tailor?" he asked aloud. Folek stepped out from behind a rack of clothes. "Not here. Just me." His body stiffened, but his face stayed neutral. "Detective, you're far from Lagos." "And you're far from the truth," she replied. Before she could move, Richard bolted for the back door. Officers lunged. Chairs toppled, and a sewing machine clattered to the floor. Folek chased him into the alley, her shoes pounding the dirt. He was fast, darting between houses, knocking over market stalls. Folek's breath burned in her chest, but she kept him in sight. They rounded a corner and came face to face with Idris, who had looped around. Richard froze for half a second, then spun, but Folek was already on him. She slammed him against the wall, snapping cuffs onto his wrists. "You're done," she hissed. Richard only smiled faintly, as if he knew something she didn't. "You think so? You have no idea how many more there are." Back at the station, they logged the malt bottles from the sewing shop into evidence. The lab confirmed what they already knew, the same pesticide. But Folek wasn't celebrating. Richard's words stuck in her mind. How many more there are? That night, she sat in her car outside the station, staring at the case files. If he was telling the truth, then this wasn't the end. And worse, if he got a clever enough lawyer, even this arrest might not stick. For the first time, Folake felt the weight of doubt pressing hard on her chest. What if she couldn't stop him? Folake sat alone in her office, the hum of the ceiling fan doing little to ease the stifling heat. Outside, the station was noisy with ringing phones and clattering keyboards, but in here it was quiet. Too quiet. Richard sat in a holding cell downstairs, leaning casually against the wall like a man waiting for a bus. He had refused to speak without a lawyer, and the one who arrived, a sharp-eyed man in an expensive suit, had already filed a motion to dismiss the charges for lack of direct evidence of intent. If the judge bought it, Richard could walk. Folake rubbed her temples. They had the poison bottles, yes, but connecting them to the older murders still felt like chasing smoke. And the truth was, Richard had never directly said the words, "I poison her." He was too careful for that. By late afternoon, Idris walked in carrying a dusty cardboard box. "This was in the evidence room," he said, "from the Enugu case." Folake glanced at it. "We've been through that already." "Not everything," Idris replied, pulling out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside was an old smartphone, its screen cracked. It belonged to Blessing, the widow from Enugu. The case went cold before anyone unlocked it. Folake frowned. "Can we still get in?" Idris grinned faintly. "Already did. You need to see this." The phone's gallery was filled with everyday photos, family gatherings, church events, but buried between them was a short video. The date stamp showed it was recorded the night before Blessing died. In the video, she sat at her dining table, smiling shyly into the camera. Across from her, only partly in frame, was Richard. His voice was unmistakable. "Drink up," he said warmly. "You need your strength for tomorrow." The bottle in her hand was the same brand of malt as in every other case. Folake felt her heart race. "That's not enough to convict him for the older cases," she said slowly, "but it shows a pattern. And combined with our current evidence, it nails his method." Idris nodded. "The prosecutor will love this." That night, Folake visited Amara in the hospital again. She looked stronger now, able to sit up without help. "We have him," Folake said quietly. "We found something from an old case, enough to prove his pattern and keep him in custody." Amara's lips trembled. "So he won't be able to hurt anyone else?" Folake hesitated. "We'll make sure of it." The trial prep moved fast. The prosecutor was eager to present Richard as a serial predator, using romance as bait and poison as his weapon. The video from Blessing's phone became a key piece of evidence, alongside the bottles from Amara's case and the sewing shop in Abeokuta. But on the eve of the trial, Folake got a call from an unknown number. When she answered, the voice on the other end was calm, almost amused. "You think you won, detective," Richard said. "But the people I work with, they don't forgive loose ends. Watch your back." The line went dead. Folake sat frozen, phone still in her hand. She knew threats were common from desperate suspects, but this felt different, measured, almost certain. And in that moment, she realized something terrifying. Richard might not have been working alone. The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras clicking as Richard was escorted inside in handcuffs. Amara sat in the second row behind the prosecution table, her face pale but resolute. She refused to let him see her afraid. Folake stood near the door, watching as the jury filed in. She'd spent months building this case. Every late night, every dead end, every terrifying moment when she thought Richard might slip away. Now it all came down to this. The prosecution's opening statement was clear and cutting. The defendant preyed on vulnerable women, gaining their trust before poisoning them with pesticide-laced drinks. We will show his pattern of behavior across multiple states, culminating in his attempted murder of Mrs. Amara Joseph, the woman who sold her home to save his life. One by one, the evidence came out. The poison bottles from the sewing shop, the lab reports showing the exact same chemical in Amara's blood, the delivery records from the bottling company linking Richard to multiple victims. And then came the video from Blessing's phone. The jury watched as Richard's voice filled the courtroom, urging her to drink up. Folake saw several jurors exchange uneasy glances. Richard's lawyer fought hard, arguing that there was no proof he personally put poison in any drink. But under cross-examination, Richard made a slip when the prosecutor asked, "Why were you in possession of multiple bottles of the same brand found at all the crime scenes?" Richard replied, "Because it was easier to use the same." He stopped himself, but it was too late. The jury had heard it. Midway through the trial, Folake received a quiet tip from an informant. Richard had ties to a small fraud syndicate operating in Lagos and Port Harcourt. Several members had passed arrests for extortion and even violent crimes. Folake realized the helper who'd engineered his escape during the blackout was likely part of this group. Richard wasn't just acting alone. He was part of a network that targeted women for both financial and personal gain. When this was revealed in court, it destroyed the defense's image of him as a misunderstood man. Now, he looked like a calculating predator with a support system. After 2 tense weeks, the jury returned. The foreman's voice was steady. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. Amara closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Folake allowed herself a small breath of relief. The judge sentenced Richard to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, Amara walked slowly toward Folake. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Folake shook her head. "No, Amara, you kept yourself alive long enough for us to get him. That's your victory, too." Weeks later, Folake received a sealed envelope at her office. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words written in neat handwriting. "We are watching." She folded it and locked it away. Richard was behind bars, but his words still echoed in her mind. And she knew, deep down, that somewhere out there, the rest of his network was still moving in the shadows. But for now, at least for now, Amara Joseph could sleep in peace.